Thank you very much for the rather lengthy introduction. Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank the committee, the Ottawa Mahatma Gandhi Society, for inviting me to share some of my thoughts on Gandhi and women. I'm indeed impressed by your latest achievement. You have been able to acquire a piece of land to put up the statue of Mahatma Gandhi. Hopefully next year when I come and visit you, it would be under that tree, under that statue. And I was telling Agarwal ji, I hope you get that statue with the stick, the beautiful Mahatma standing full length with that stick on his Dandi march, the 1930 Salt March. Anyway, so I try and keep it as, I was told I can speak for 40 minutes. Let's see how I do. And do stop me when it gets a little boring, okay? All right. The history of a nation is the history of its famous men and women who have shaped the destiny of their country in keeping with the ethos that particular nation has developed over the years. In the case of India, which has a recorded history reaching back to at least 5,000 years, it is possible to find remarkable women, both as intellectuals and as warriors, who could hold their own against the men of their times. But they were individual women excelling in their chosen area of occupation. While individuals were there in plenty, Indian history does not record a mass movement of women fighting for a cause, coming out of their homes in large numbers. One witnessed such a phenomenon at the time of Gandhi, who was able to galvanize the women folk to participate in record numbers during the freedom struggle, particularly the 1920s and 1930s. As a unique phenomenon, not only in the context of Indian history, but of that of world history, one is tempted to examine the reason for this response that Gandhi was able to evoke amongst all classes of women, and in particular the middle class women, who are usually the most conservative and reluctant to change their ways of life in any society. Gandhi's life is an open book, and it is well known that Gandhi, before starting his political experiments in India, had already tested those methods in his South African struggles during the years 1893 to 1914 for a period of 21 years. He came to South Africa a young man of 24 and left the land when he was past 44. Thus, it is reasonable to assume that his ideas on many a topic were well formed by the time he landed in India. One could venture to state that but for the South African experience, Gandhiji's approach to the problem of women may not have been so all-encompassing as to include within its scope the sociological and psychological dimensions of the status of women in the country. Gandhiji would himself refer to his South African experience throughout his life in India. With regard to the problem of women in particular, he believed that he had the capacity to draw out the best in women, even illiterate women at that. Thus, Gandhi writes in Harijan, I quote, "In South Africa, I had become a father or brother of women belonging to about 60 families. Although these women were illiterate, I brought out the courage in them and they went to jail as bravely as men," unquote. Gandhi believed sincerely that he understood women better than they did themselves. "I have always counted myself as a woman," he said. "I believe I know your sex and your needs better than you do yourselves." On one occasion, he says, "My correspondents do not perhaps know that I began service of India's women in South Africa more than 40 years ago, when perhaps none of them were born," unquote. Gandhi's success in the upliftment of women can be measured by the kind of women who burst upon the Indian scene in the 1920s, and courageous women willing to face any danger with that rare strength which can only come when it is rooted in moral conviction. I wonder how many of you in the audience have heard of the name Kamala Devi Chattopadhyaya. In the late 1920s and 1930s, Kamala Devi was in the forefront of the fight for India's freedom, having come under the magic spell of Mahatma Gandhi, like so many other women at that time. The Salt Satyagraha, which electrified the nation in 1930, was in response to Gandhi's call for India's self-respect. Gandhi's message on this occasion read, "At present, Indian self-respect is symbolized, as it were, in a handful of salt in the Satyagrahi's hand. Let the fist be broken, but let there be no surrender of salt," he said. People from all walks of life, young and old, men and women, rich and poor, joined this movement as it was something they could understand and identify with. Kamala Devi during the struggle invaded the precincts of the Bombay Stock Exchange with a band of lady volunteers and sold tiny packets of illegally made salt for rupees 40,000, a big amount then, in less than 1 hour. What followed afterwards is even more daring. Where on her arrest and on being asked if she pleaded guilty, she invited the trying magistrate to resign from the service of imperialism and join her band of civil resistors. Presently, ignoring the rather dazed magistrate, she started selling contraband salt in the courtroom itself. Kamala Devi and many like her, born to a life of luxury and leisure, abandoned their comfortable lives and joined the freedom movement in India in response to Gandhi's charismatic leadership. But Gandhi's appeal was not restricted to such women alone. Gandhi's religious and moral approach appealed to the middle classes and to the middle class women in particular. Never before in recorded history did women in such large numbers actively participate in a political movement of such dimensions. Gandhi was a unique blend of ancient wisdom and modern pragmatism. He effectively employed in an unprecedented manner the religious principles of toleration and self-abnegation in the political arena. Such an application of religious values to practical politics was an unusual phenomenon, and it exasperated many of Gandhi's opponents as well as his friends. It led to such remarks as, "Politics is a game of worldly people and not for sadhus," by Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and "The saint has left our shores, I sincerely hope forever," by General Smuts. But for Gandhi himself, this combination of the sadhu and the politician was hardly a problem. In him, the religious means of satyagraha could be used for a political end, and it was perhaps his genius which made this combination appear quite normal. It is for lesser mortals who perceive life in fragments and compartments that an irreconcilable dichotomy presents itself. The sadhu in the Mahatma engaged itself in the spiritual domain without in any way affecting his concerns about the earth. For to Gandhi, life was a whole where all differences can be reconciled into a harmonious unity. Holding that there is a universal human nature which mirrors the divine, he found it natural to use his own life as a crucible in which to test his principles and precepts. His childhood experiences also helped in forming his early impressions, and for he found that the practical application of religion to everyday life was imprinted on his mind, watching the lives of 3 women who, without any attempt to instruct, but by their very examples, served as his first teachers. Born in a Vaishnava family, with its belief in bhakti and total surrender to the divine, he also imbibed the toleration of the Jaina saints, exemplified in their doctrine of Anekantavada or Syadvada, which willingly admitted the possibility of many views to the same truth. The way to develop this attitude was also laid down both in the Hindu and Jaina ways of life as the 5-fold basic principles of adherence to truth, non-violence, self-control, non-stealing, and lack of desire to possess anything. It was in the lives of these 3 women, closely associated with him, that he found these religious truths translated into everyday practice. They were his mother Putlibai, his maid Rambha, and later on his wife Kasturba. These 3 women showed him the path of self-purification, without which one cannot come face to face with truth. One of the ways to that purification was through prayer and fasts, which would later become a regular feature in Gandhi's life, not for the sake of coercing one's opponent, but in order to purify oneself, so that by some kind of inverse reaction, it would act on the opponent to enable the opponent to see the wisdom of the opposite view. The practice of observing fasts was common in all Hindu homes, including his own, but somehow confined only to the women folk and not observed by the men folk anymore. Gandhi's young mind must have associated this connection as in some way explaining the proximity of women to purity and spirituality in comparison to men, which he would use with great force later in mobilizing women to the spinning wheel and weaving of khadi as a means to self-respect, self-dependence, and realizing the goal of Swaraj, the ultimate goal. Gandhi thus saw his mother never eating her meal without prayer and visiting the temple regularly. Fasts, both long and short, were common for her, and the difficult vow of Chaturmas, or fast for 4 months of the rainy season, when meals were taken only after the sight of the sun, sometimes meant going without food, as one could often not see the sun in person, which was indeed difficult in that small sea coast town of Porbandar. The children of the house, including Gandhi, would keep vigil over the skies and rush to tell their mother the moment the sun appeared. But sometimes, by the time Putlibai came out, the sun would be hidden again, and then she would say, "That does not matter. God does not want me to eat today." All this piety must have gone to strengthen the moral fiber of this young lad, who was already showing signs of ethical and moral purity of a high order not common in children of that age. It was Ramba, his maid, who taught him the efficacy of the name of Rama to ward off all childhood fears of darkness and imaginary ghosts. Hare Rama was always on his lips for the rest of his life, whether in far-off South Africa, when he was attacked and hurled down by a burly Pathan, or later when he died from the bullets of Nathuram Godse on 30th January 1948. These were the last words uttered by Mahatma Gandhi, and he thus immortalized the simple maid Ramba of his childhood days. But it was to Kasturba, his wife and companion for 62 years, that he owed the teaching of nonviolence and determined resistance to injustice. "I learned the lesson of nonviolence from my wife," he says, "when I tried to bend her to my will. Her determined resistance to my will on the one hand, and her quiet submission to my stupidity on the other, ultimately made me ashamed of myself and cured me of my stupidity, and in the end, she became my teacher in nonviolence." The potency of passive resistance as a weapon of power, transcending the personal level, was also a lesson learned from Indian women, as he told Mrs. Pollock on one occasion. Quote, "I see that more and more women are going to play an important part in the affairs of the world. They will be a great asset to any movement. I have learnt more of passive resistance as a weapon of power from Indian women than from anyone else." Unquote. These initial lessons in spirituality, as lived in everyday life, would form the springboard for Gandhi to dive deep into the Hindu tradition, and he would come up with ever new insights which were put to test in his own life and in the lives of those who chose to follow him. One of the very first fruits of this introspection would come out in the form of Satyagraha, which was forged in South Africa by combining the teachings of not only his own religion, but also those elements in other religions to which he was exposed by then. The very interpretation of Satyagraha as moral force, soul force, or truth force brings out his originality in thinking. Initially called passive resistance, the later name of Sadagraha, suggested by Madan Lal, was altered to Satyagraha by Gandhi and has now gone into the annals of history as one of the most effective weapons used in the fight for the independence of India. But it is to South Africa one has to turn to see how Gandhi slowly but surely channelized woman power into an effective means of resistance. The 19th century and early 20th century threw up a number of reformers, and Gandhi grew up in an atmosphere which had witnessed the action of such social reformers as Karve, Ram Mohan Roy, Vivekananda, and others. His 3-year stint in England during this period, at an impressionable age of his life, must also have made its impact on his mind. All this churning of ideas and facing of the practical human situation in South Africa brought out the concept of Satyagraha, almost like the nectar that came out of the churning of the milk in Hindu mythology. While Gandhi cannot be credited for being a pioneer in drawing attention to the plight of women in society, there was a vital difference in his approach to the problem of women's disabilities. Gandhi in many ways was a traditionalist and a conservative in his attitude towards women. But his conservatism was informed by a practical wisdom and a sense of overall welfare of the family. As long as the family was not disrupted, he said, the women had the freedom to contribute their might equally with men in any sphere they chose to work in. While that is what Gandhi says on many an occasion, when that is read with the primary function of looking after the home and bringing up children, which is basically the duty of women according to Gandhi, does it really mean anything much? If, for instance, the pressing need for women to participate in the freedom struggle did not exist, would Gandhi have encouraged women to come out and compete with men in all walks of life, as did happen during the Gandhian era? These are questions which cannot be easily answered. But it is a fact of history that up to this time, in spite of reformers looking at individual issues that affected women's lives in general, such as widow remarriage or the custom of sati, no thought was given to improving the lot of women as a whole, for the realization as yet had not dawned that these individual issues were manifestations of the broader evil of the inferior status of women in society. Women were visualized, and perhaps are still visualized, as belonging to the interior world of the home, where all that was good and spiritual was transmitted through her to the offspring, and thence to the outer material world, which is the man's domain. Gandhi was able to break through this cliched model of the inner and outer worlds, but as pointed out earlier, in his own personal philosophy, he was content to view women as becoming independent and as achieving their cherished goals while staying within the role assigned to them by nature. Even as late as 1934 and 1940, he would write in Harijan, I quote, "I do not envisage the wife as a rule following an avocation independently of the husband. The care of the children and the upkeep of the household are quite enough to fully engage all her energy. The man should look to the maintenance of the family, the woman to household management," unquote. Women in the new order, he believed in that fervently. In his personal life and in the ashrams he set up, women and men did all jobs without any discrimination. While he was a champion of women's rights and helped them to discover their potential and advocated their equality with men, he was not as yet ready to break with tradition. His ideal of woman would certainly not be the modern woman going out into the wide world, competing with men equally in all spheres. I do believe that woman will not make her contribution to the world by mimicking or running a race with men, he said. She can run the race, but she will not rise to great heights she is capable of by mimicking man. She has to be the complement of man, unquote. Gandhi, like most men born at that time and in the Hindu tradition, was an inheritor of a complex attitude towards them women folk. While the religion itself allowed the highest status to the female goddess pictured as the mother in her various forms, and also glorified women as the custodians of all that was spiritual and pure, there was the other lived tradition before his eyes, which degraded women and treated them with scant respect. Gandhi strove to retain the spiritual aspect even while freeing women, first in her own mind and then restoring the dignity due to her, as she has an equal right of freedom and liberty with men. Let us go back to South Africa in order to try and understand how this shy person who, when thrown into the company of strange women in England, was very often tongue-tied, gradually got used to working with women as much as with men in Phoenix and Tolstoy farms in South Africa. In Phoenix and Tolstoy farm, he had encouraged women settlers to participate in new styles where they were not only treated as equals with the male members of the communities, but educated in far more open social relations between people of different communities and castes than would have been possible in India. Amongst Gandhi's circle of women workers were such foreigners as Miss Dick, Mrs. West, Miss Hobson, Miss Oliver Schreiner, Miss Malteno, Mrs. Pollock, and others. Each one of them was unique, totally committed to the cause she had adopted. Thus, Gandhi's opinion of what women were capable of was formed from such remarkable women, both foreign and Indian. He worked with in South Africa, and it appeared he never changed his views regarding them, even when the women did not rise up to his expectations in India. While Gandhi himself was getting to be comfortable dealing with women as equals in South Africa, the women on their part also grew equally in their self-esteem and got used to being treated as equals to men because of the circumstances in which they were placed, which required socializing with different people from all walks of life who lived in both these establishments. This liberation of the mental horizon on both sides also went together with the gradual awakening of the women to the tremendous potential they had. That was a very big contribution of Gandhiji. And in the Indian Opinion, which is the paper he established in South Africa in 1906, he writes that there was a unique opportunity to educate the women in South Africa to what was in store for them, presented itself in the form of the women's suffragette movement in England. Gandhi used this occasion to air his views on the women's problem and thereby sensitize the women through the columns of the Indian Opinion. In one issue, December 1906, he writes, "Undaunted, these women who were working in England, these women work steadfast in their cause. They are bound to succeed and gain the franchise for the simple reason that deeds are better than words. Even those who laughed at them would be left wondering, if even women display such courage, will the Transvaal Indians," he's using that example, "will they fail in their duty and be afraid of jail? Or would they rather consider the jail a palace and readily go there?" The subtle play on the emotions of men by holding these brave women as examples cannot be missed. Writing under the heading "Brave Women," he says again, "When the government showed willingness to grant special treatment in jail to the brave daughter of the late Mr. Cobden, she replied, 'No matter how I suffer, I shall seek no favor from you. I am in jail for my own and my sister's rights, and I will live like a common prisoner till the franchise is granted.'" Gandhiji writes, "Such words have stirred up public feeling in their favor, and the papers which used to ridicule them before have stopped doing so. Every Indian in the Transvaal should take to heart the example of these brave women." It was in these formative years, from 1906 onwards, which changed the outlook of the Indian women in South Africa. The time to test this growth of egalitarian ideas presented itself in the form of a court's judgment jeopardizing all marriages performed by Hindu, Muslim, or Zoroastrian rites. The South African Supreme Court declared on March 14, 1913, to the effect that all marriages were outside the pale of legal marriages in South Africa, with the exception of such as were celebrated according to Christian rites and registered by the Registrar of Marriages. As this was an issue which affected the women directly, Gandhi invited them openly to join the Satyagraha struggle, which was in any case in the process of being intensified under the Black Act. I can't go into that now, what is the Black Act, etc. Having thrown the gauntlet, Gandhi was also worried about this new development, that Indian women had resolved to go to jail in defiance of the Marriage Act. This was the first time in South Africa women under Gandhi's leadership determined to go on Satyagraha and to court jail as well. After all, marriage was not just a social event for the Hindu women. While all marriages were made in heaven, for the Hindu in particular, there were many levels at which a marriage was spiritualized, revolving round the concept of dharma. It was therefore but natural that many of these women were willing to go to any length against this unlawful act. While some women had been arrested earlier in connection with the registration issue, they had not been direct participants so far. But here the women were in the forefront to defend what they rightly believed to be their only lives. It is quite likely that amongst the women at the meetings addressed by Gandhi, there were some older women who had come along with their spouses from India and others who had married in South Africa itself. It was a trying period for all, and for Gandhi in particular, who was convinced about the justice of their cause and their right to offer Satyagraha, but who had to shoulder the responsibility of leading them in the path of Satyagraha. He went about it earnestly and explained to them the hardships of jail life and even exaggerated the factor of the hardships of jail life. I gave them an idea of the risks incidental to such participation, he says. I explained to them that they would have to put up with restraints in the matter of food, dress, and personal movements. I warned them that they might be given hard work in jail, made to wash clothes, and even subjected to insult by the warders. Unquote. Gandhi mentions the names of 11 women who decided to offer stubborn satyagraha in response to the call, and says one of them was pregnant while 6 of them had young babies in arms. Visualize that scene. His own family, including Kasturba and his children, were part of this historic satyagraha battle. It will be pertinent to review here certain aspects of Gandhi's relationship with Kasturba, which had undergone some changes from their earlier days in South Africa. During that time, on one occasion, when he had insisted on Kasturba cleaning a chamber pot of a Christian clerk of Panchama parentage, he had behaved like a despot and a dictator, not willing to admit that everybody cannot be like him, even if belonging to his own family, and even if it was his own wife. Gandhi thought that this was an irrational prejudice, not fully appreciating Kasturba's earlier upbringing in a traditional setting which she was not ready to shed, unlike himself. He insisted that she should not only perform the distasteful task, but do so cheerfully or else leave him, and almost threw her into the streets. For one who believed in coming to decisions by shared participation, this was indeed an act of insanity due to his obsession with a moral principle. One recalls the behavior of Rama, of Ramayana fame, Gandhi's own ideal, whom he repeatedly idealized as the ideal king. Gandhi's own Rama banished Sita, I think you know the story, his faithful wife, to the forest in response to an imaginary slur cast on the character of Sita because of her being a captive in Ravana's palace when she was abducted and carried away by him. Rama's action was rooted in his concept of an ideal king upholding the rules of dharma to its very end. If then Rama was behaving morally towards his subjects, which morality was to be judged superior? His response to an imaginary moral lapse rumored in the city of Ayodhya, or his moral duty to protect his pregnant wife Sita, besides being his wife, was also a subject in his own kingdom? Rama probably decided to banish Sita in keeping with the norms of his age, and that is where the relative superiority of different moral options present themselves in any society. While Rama as a king had to place his kingly duties, which he owed to others, on a scale higher than what he owed to his family, due to the prevailing convention, Gandhi and Kasturba were born into families which were not expected to perform the duties that Gandhi expected Kasturba to perform. While he himself, because of his greater moral strength and sense of justice, could overcome such conventions, Kasturba was not as yet ready to do so. Instead of sympathizing with her plight, Gandhi, blinded by his notion of what is right, created a situation which was only saved by Kasturba's compliance. While the above incident was an extreme example of the dominating role that Gandhi exercised in his relationship with his wife, there were many instances in which Gandhi appeared not to have shed his role as the Indian male of the house, taking decisions to be followed by the women in the ashramas. Life at Phoenix, for instance, reflected more or less life in an Indian setting, where men take the decisions and women follow them. Very often, decisions regarding changes in diet and other changes in healthcare were taken by the men, Gandhi, Pollock, and Kallenbach, and the women were just informed about them and were expected to implement them. Fatima Mir writes in her biography of Gandhi, I quote, Kallenbach shared many interests with Mohan and Pollock, and the three would be found locked for hours in long discussions about life, about how life could be lived more morally and therefore more simply. The women would wait in trepidation for the results of such discussions, for they knew that they would be forced to make new, unappealing adjustments, unquote. Throughout his life, Gandhi exhibited this streak of autocracy, especially if it concerned his near and dear ones. He was the undisputed mentor and infallible guide of all for whose welfare, physical, mental, and moral, he held himself responsible. Whatever be his fancies and fads of the time must be accepted and adopted by them, not sullenly, but cheerfully. This came to my mind while talking to Mrs. Sita Dupelia, the oldest grandchild of Gandhi, who lived in South Africa till she died somewhere in the 90s, and I had the privilege of knowing her, and she had the privilege of seeing her grandfather in action in India, where besides the intermittent visits to the family, she spent almost 6 important years of her youth from 1943 to 1948 taking part in the Satyagraha movement in India. After she moved to South Africa in 1948, she along with her father Manilal, mother Sushila, and siblings Arun and Ila continued Gandhi's Satyagraha whenever there was a need for it. Coming back to the story of Mrs. Dupelia, she was born in 1928 and she was named Dhairya Bala, which means the brave girl, by her maternal grandfather Mashruwala, a staunch follower of Gandhi, and she fondly recalls how Bapuji requested the family to change her name from Dhairya Bala to Sita. The 20s and 30s of the 20th century were the years when the mass of Indian women rose to support Gandhi in his program of spinning and weaving of khadi. They were also in the forefront, picketing liquor shops and turning men away from consumption of alcoholic drinks, and many women went into the villages to educate and ameliorate the conditions of the poor, oppressed women there. Gandhi was able to inspire and lead this mighty awakening of women from its long slumber of many centuries, and one of the symbols he effectively used for this purpose was the legendary figure of Sita of Ramayana fame. Gandhi never asked anyone to do what he himself could not do, and all his experiments started with him or his family first. It was but natural that the name Sita should come to Gandhi's mind as the one most suited for his first grandchild, born in that historic period when women marched shoulder to shoulder with men in many of his movements. If Gandhi felt that what he was doing was right, then having made up his mind intuitively, he pursued it rationally and relentlessly till he succeeded. It was therefore right for him to insist on Dhairya Bala to be renamed as Sita, and of course he succeeded, for who could oppose the Mahatma? But to the child Dhairya Bala, who had got used to being called Dhairya Bala by then, this was like taking away her identity. She related this to me herself. Gandhi also does not seem to have consulted Kasturba on many an occasion when things affected both of them. Even when he took the vow of Brahmacharya in South Africa in 1906, there is no indication anywhere that he consulted Kasturba and then reached the decision jointly. He communicated his decision to her and interpreted that as having obtained her approval. Kasturba must have learned to recognize this mood time and again in Gandhi. When, for instance, on one occasion, before going on a fast, she was worried, Sushila Nayak consoled her, saying, Bapu has said that he will not fast unless there is a clear call from God to do so. God will never tell him to go on a fast, said Sushila Nayak. Kasturba replied, quote, I know that, but what if Bapu makes up his mind that God wants him to do so, unquote. This trait in Gandhi's character was noted by many, and Krishna Kripalani mentions that once Gandhi had made up his mind, nothing was allowed to come in the way. While some of this behavior could be excused, as these were the formative years in Gandhi's experiments with truth, others do not fit in with the kind, humane individual that history has come to know. Gandhi was generous enough to admit his mistake and thus obliterate any feelings of ill will in the hearts of those he offended. He would later regret his cruelty towards Kasturba and recorded that he had been a cruelly kind husband. His zeal for his moral commitments at this stage certainly overtook his better judgment, especially when it involved his own immediate family. While he was realizing and moving towards the Hindu ideal of the whole world is one family, Gandhi believed in that doctrine. Somehow, when translated into practice, that meant that he would be more concerned about people outside of his own family. He tended to see his family as the least important of all, for his family was in a sense himself. The ideal of Rama, his favorite hero and god, was ever present in his mind, but it was also true that at this point in his life, he was very much concerned with public opinion and his image in the public eye, and therefore his concern for being more than correct towards his family is understandable. Gandhi probably took it for granted that his immediate family would forgive him readily as they were closest to him and would understand his behavior better. The tragic life of his eldest son Hiralal, who it seems never forgave his father for the deprivations he had to undergo, goes to prove how wrong he was. It is interesting to note that Kasturba was initially excluded. Initially she was excluded from the Satyagraha preparations which were being planned in South Africa against the Marriage Act. The reasons given by Gandhi, I'm stressing this because I want to show you how he was concerned about public opinion at first, which he later transcended in his experiments in India. The reasons given by Gandhi were that Kasturba would not say no to any proposal he made. He also must have known that her agreeing to any of his plans could also be due to her having no choice in the matter. How can Kasturba conclude otherwise when on the 2 or 3 occasions she had tried to protest, he had reacted by asking her to leave him, or when she had failed to change his mind regarding her children's education in an European school, and again when he made her return the ornaments given as gifts by the Indians on their departure to India in 1901, in spite of her strong inclination to keep them. He was a man past 40 by now and was reconciled to the fact that Kasturba could have a different view on this matter of Satyagraha, but there was a vital difference between the issues on which they differed earlier and now. While earlier they were all private matters which could be solved within the sphere of the home, with each party retaining his or her own opinions, this case of Satyagraha was a very different matter altogether. He pleaded with Kasturba that his intention was not to exclude her, but that, he quotes, I quote, "I would be only too glad if you went to jail, but it would not appear at all as you went at my instance. In matters like this, everyone should act relying solely upon one's own strength and courage. If I asked you, you might be inclined to go just for the sake of complying with my request. And then, if you began to tremble in the law court or were terrified by hardships in jail, I could not find fault with you, but how would it stand with me? How could I then harbor you or look the world in the face? It is fears like these which have prevented me from asking you to quote, to go to jail." Unquote. It is significant that Gandhi was worried about facing the world in case Kasturba failed, for he had not yet attained that level of detachment which would induce him to state later to Sushila, Manila's wife and his daughter-in-law, "Don't mind what she says," and he even reluctantly accepted Kasturba's interference in the ashram life in Sabarmati and even tolerated her indulgence in special foods in the ashram against the general rules. However, in this instance, Kasturba take part in the Satyagraha movement against the Marriage Act. To come back to the Marriage Act and the Women's Satyagraha, he was overwhelmed to see that the experiment was a complete success. His confidence in women now really came to a height. All the women and later the men who joined proved themselves more than equal to the task. It will be good to let Gandhi speak about this first mass Satyagraha movement led by women in South Africa. I quote, "The women's bravery was beyond words. They were all kept in the Maritzburg jail, where they were considerably harassed. Their food was of the worst quality, and they were given laundry work as their task. No food was permitted to be given to them from outside nearly till the end of their term. One of the women, called Valliyamma, returned from jail with a fatal fever to which she succumbed shortly. This Valliyamma became immortalized in history and had a plaque erected in her memory at Johannesburg in July 15, 1914. This women's satyagraha opened the eyes of the world to the conditions in South Africa, and since world opinion was clearly on the side of the oppressed satyagrahis, it ended with the repeal of the £3 tax and the validation of Indian marriages and the grant of some trifling concessions in addition. This happy ending, I'm sure, was largely due to the women entering the satyagraha movement. As pointed out earlier, when Gandhi finally returned to India in 1914, he was already 44 years of age. It will be useful to remind ourselves that his ideas on many a matter were more or less formed by then. These were the ideas that he applied successfully in India, and one can assert with a certain degree of confidence that while the ideas themselves could have been refined in the course of Gandhi's Indian years, there were no new breakthroughs which had not already been born and tested in South Africa. Thus, his principle of satyagraha remained the same, except, of course, as we all know, it got more and more polished as time went by. The vow of brahmacharya was taken in 1906, and he had started observing fasts and long periods of prayer, both in Phoenix and Tolstoy Farm. His inner voice and the religious spirit within him became a living force during his stay in South Africa, and he dated his awareness of it for the first time in 1906. His involvement with the sick and the poor, his experiments in nature cure and dietary restrictions, as also his discarding of an opulent lifestyle to a life of simplicity, were all part of his South African legacy and a result of his firm belief that man's ultimate aim is the realization of God, and all his activities, social, political, and religious, have to be guided by the ultimate aim of the vision of God. To take up the question of women and Gandhi from where we left off, namely 1914, he had to shift to India. From the time he set up his Rashtra at Sabarmati till the late 1930s, Gandhi was in the forefront, coaxing, guiding, preaching, and relentlessly addressing women's meetings to break the barriers created in society and within their own mental makeup. His active participation in the education of women to their innate capabilities can be addressed at various levels. Going through the speeches and writings of Gandhi from the 1920s, it becomes clear that he was concerned to somehow restore women to a position of equality with men, but at the same time making herself realize that it should not be done to the detriment of the home, family, and particularly the rearing up of children. Before attempting to analyze the various methods Gandhi employed to draw out women, it would be proper to state one or two well-known facts just to get the picture in its proper perspective. Almost all the writings and speeches addressed to women in India by Gandhi are directed towards restoring their lost dignity and instilling confidence in them to face the world as equals of men, to men. Gandhi believed that once this condition was fulfilled, it would automatically result in women responding to situations in terms of justice and fair play. He thus led a consistent campaign to uplift women from their degraded state, which would result in the liberation of the woman, first in her mind, and then to enable her to come out with a head held high, openly into the arena of the wild world. As this campaign was led by Gandhi, who stood for all middle-class values, it had the added advantage of general acceptance from men from all walks of life. While some dissident voices were heard, they were just ripples in the vast ocean of the general mood of upliftment of women. It is this mood of acceptance of women as equals, initiated by Gandhi, that enabled Rajkumari Amrit Kaur to become a cabinet minister in the very first cabinet after independence in India in 1947. Even earlier, the election of Sarojini Naidu as the Congress president for the 1926 session was indeed a bold step in the recognition of the equal status of Indian women. Though Annie Besant had earlier held the office, it was not the same as an Indian woman being given her due in a society long used to ignoring the rightful claims of women as equals. The pace of change for equality of women was set in motion in society once and for all, and one can assert confidently that it was the leadership role that Gandhi assumed almost single-handedly that brought about in a large measure a change of heart, particularly amongst the middle classes in India. There was no looking back after that, and if today we find Indian women in all walks of life, police, army, wherever you want to look at, crowding all places of work, the credit must definitely be given to Gandhiji, who was able to achieve this in a miraculous way. It is at this stage that one wonders, what is it that helped Gandhi to succeed so well where others had failed? First and foremost was the fact that Gandhi had become a household name in India by the time he returned in 1914 because of his South African activities. He was seen as one who risked his life fighting for justice, or more importantly, against injustice in any form. His role in leading women satyagrahis in South Africa must have made a deep impression on the Indian women who knew that they could trust and rely on Gandhi, who not only outlined a plan of action, but was himself always eager to participate actively in carrying out the plans he outlined. Women intuitively responded to the sincerity and moral appeal that Gandhi stood for. Gandhi's bottom line was self-sacrifice, and he was never tired of saying that women had a special capacity for self-sacrifice. But would Gandhi have succeeded so eminently had it not been for the glamour of having succeeded through his middle-class moral values in a foreign country? All said and done, Gandhi's entire campaign, both in South Africa and in India, had the stamp of a middle-class obsession with moral values and honor. This was to continue throughout his life and sometimes baffle leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru, C.R. Das, and others when Gandhi would suddenly halt the civil disobedience movement even when plans for it were meticulously planned, as he did in the suspension of the Bardoli movement in 1922. Subhash Chandra Bose's remark on this occasion, cited by B.R. Nanda, mirrors the mood of rage and disappointment at this decision of Gandhi. Bose says, I was with Deshbandhu at that time, and I could see that he was beside himself with anger and sorrow at the way Mahatma Gandhi was repeatedly bungling. But to the middle-class Indian women, he was someone they could easily identify with. Even the language he used to instruct and inspire them was the religious language they were used to in their homes and in their everyday lives. Gandhi's emphasis was not on the rights of women, nor did he confuse the women folk by talking in a modern jargon. A down-to-earth approach combined with a language recalling the traditional symbols and characters the women could identify with was the approach that Gandhi adopted. Gandhi made the call to return to one's glorious past, but he did not use the familiar philosophical figures of this period like the Upanishadic Gargi or Maitreyi to drive his point home. The 19th or 20th century reformers who adopted this methodology, but their emphasis was at an intellectual level, as for instance the leaders of the Brahma Samaj movement. Gandhi also made no attempt to apply these ideas actively in sociological settings with a focus on a religious revival, as for instance the Arya Samaj movement. Instead, Gandhi used characters like Sita, Draupadi, Damayanti, Savitri, and others who were the role models for these women to touch their hearts by interpreting their lives in order to improve their lot. It is ironical that in feminist circles today, these very characters are cited as examples of female degradation. That is precisely the point. Gandhi was not attempting an analytical approach in his assessments of characters like Sita, in which case he would have found himself in a difficult position. But he highlighted those incidents in the lives of these familiar figures that would enthuse the women to reform themselves and instill in them an identity as women and a sense of dignity as worthy human beings. I'll give you one example. It is interesting to see how Gandhi used Sita as a metaphor for whatever he wanted to preach. Thus, at a women's meeting on January 9, 1927 at Banaras, he says, I quote, "The first thing is that if you want Swaraj or Ramarajya in India, you have to become pure as Sita. Sita was pure in body and mind. When she was put through the ordeal on her return from Lanka, the flames did not even touch her. Why? Because she was pure, not only in body, but also in mind. No cloth was imported from England at the time. English cloth was not worn. All women plied the charka and wore khadi. Foreign cloth does not add to your beauty. Real beauty consists in making body and mind pure. Only a woman who keeps her body and mind pure can be worthy of our reverence. Therefore, sisters, wear khadi, ply the charka, and become pure. Make your sons and daughters pure by having them wear khadi." Unquote. You can't analyze this. I mean, these are emotional. They are appealing to the emotion of the audience. In such speeches, the end is clearly to arouse women to take charge of their lives themselves and also contribute to the overall Swaraj campaign through the spinning and weaving of khadi. These speeches had an emotional appeal during the time of Gandhi, for the larger focus in all these movements was the emancipation of the motherland from foreign domination. Gandhi was conscious, I'm almost there, Gandhi was conscious of the many disabilities that women were subject to, and he spoke out fearlessly against enforced widowhood, parda, dedication of girls to temples, prostitution, early marriage, the dowry system, the economic bondage, and marital slavery of women. He touched on practically all the problems. But no single issue was raised above all the other disabilities. Gandhi's vision was a total one. Gandhi's campaigns were directed to the transformation of the whole human being towards a purer, more honorable behavior. Therefore, his upliftment programs for women did not confine themselves to one single issue, nor were they directed to achieve some concessions. Just as Satyagraha depended for its success on the total moral perfection of one who wields it, so also it was Gandhi's belief that each woman would, by her purity and moral fiber, be able to attain a status equal to that of any man. As if to prove him right, India produced a number of such women during those times, and the movement begun under Gandhi's leadership still continues. In conclusion, one cannot but notice that the common element in all of Gandhi's activities was the deep spiritual and religious meaning that he gave to each one of the activities that he engaged in. For Gandhi was not solely of this earth. He was traveling in the realm of the spiritual, even when dealing with concerns of the earth. Equally, he was not completely spiritual, as say the Buddha or Mahavira or Sant Kabir Das, for he was engaging in the very world with its many problems, which normally the spiritual discards before venturing on his quest for perfection. Were Satyagraha and Sarvodaya contributions to political thought, or were they new explorations in the realm of social theory and reform? The end result of Sarvodaya, or welfare for all, based on Satyagraha or truth force, had self-dependence as its basis, or self-dependence, when rightly understood and embodied, becomes the crucial lever for non-violent social transformation. Self-dependence, states Gandhi, is a necessary ideal as long as and to the extent that it is an aid to one's self-respect and spiritual discipline. It will then be seen that Gandhi's concern was to make humans, both men and women, what they were intended to be, which for him personally was the attainment of moksha or mukti. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Rukmani. I think she would be willing to take some questions for a few minutes. If you have any questions that you want to